December 9, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. The Palace of Justice stood in a city still bearing scars from Allied bombing. Inside its courtroom, a trial was about to begin that would fundamentally reshape how the world understood medical ethics, human rights, and the relationship between science and morality. 23 defendants sat in the dock. 20 of them were doctors, men who had taken an oath to heal, to do no harm, to serve humanity, men who had instead participated in systematic torture disguised as medical research, men who believed they would never face consequences because their victims had been prisoners, people the Nazi regime had classified as subhuman, people whose suffering the regime had justified through ideology and propaganda. Among those observing the trial were German prisoners of war who had been stationed at camps where experiments occurred. Some had served as guards, some had worked in administrative roles, some had been medical orderlies. All had been complicit through knowledge or participation or deliberate ignorance. They sat in a separate section of the courtroom, required to attend by American military authorities, who believed that Germans needed to witness justice being delivered for crimes committed in their nation's name. The courtroom was equipped with simultaneous translation technology. Every word spoken would be translated into German, English, French, and Russian. Every word would be documented by stenographers. Every word would become part of the permanent historical record. The trial was not secret. It was not hidden. It was public, transparent, methodical. The German prisoners of war expected speeches from lawyers. They expected debates about jurisdiction and procedure. They expected technical arguments about medical necessity and wartime conditions. What they did not expect, what they could not have prepared for, was the decision by American prosecutors to center the trial on victim testimony, to give voice to people who had been silenced by Nazi ideology, to allow survivors to speak directly about what had been done to them. The chief prosecutor, Brigadier General Telford Taylor, understood that documents and photographs were powerful evidence. But he also understood that the most devastating testimony would come from those who had survived the experiments, from people who could stand before the court, look at their torturers, and describe in their own words what had been inflicted upon them. The defendants believed that survivors would be too traumatized to speak coherently. They believed that language barriers would make testimony confusing. They believed that their credentials, their education, their professional status would shield them from serious consequences. They believed that judges would accept their explanations about scientific necessity and wartime conditions. They were wrong. The trial opened with Prosecutor Telford Taylor's statement outlining the charges. He described experiments conducted without consent. He described deliberate infliction of pain and injury. He described the use of prisoners as experimental materials. He described systematic violations of every known principle of medical ethics. But the statement was abstract. It was legal language describing crimes. It was necessary but insufficient. The real impact would come when survivors spoke, when victims became witnesses, when the silenced were given voice by American justice. On December 10, 1946, the second day of the trial, the first survivor witness was called. Her name was announced by the court clerk, Maria Kusmierczuk, Polish national, arrested in Warsaw in 1942, detained at Ravensbrück concentration camp, subject of experimental surgeries. The German prisoners of war in the observation section shifted uncomfortably. Some recognized the name from camp records. Some remembered seeing her in medical facilities. Some had participated in her transfer to the experimental ward. She walked slowly to the witness stand. Her gait was uneven, her legs bearing visible scars even through her clothing. She was 26 years old but looked older. Trauma had aged her. An interpreter stood beside her, ready to translate from Polish to English and German. The prosecutor asked her to state her name for the record. She did so, her voice quiet but steady. The prosecutor asked her to describe what had happened to her at Ravensbrück. And then Maria Kusmierczuk began to speak. And the German prisoners of war began to understand what it meant when American courts let victims speak. Maria Kusmierczuk's testimony lasted 3 hours. Every word was translated. Every word was documented. Every word was heard by the defendants, by the judges, by journalists from around the world, and by the German prisoners of war who had enabled the crimes she described. She began with her arrest. July 19, 1942. She had been a university student in Warsaw, studying literature. She had joined the resistance. distributing underground newspapers, helping organize strikes, minor acts of defiance against occupation. The Gestapo arrested her at her family's apartment. Her mother screamed. Her father tried to intervene and was beaten. Maria was taken to Paviak prison, interrogated and eventually transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. At Ravensbrück, she was assigned to a labor detail. She worked in the camp laundry, washing uniforms for guards. The work was hard but survivable. She made friends with other Polish prisoners. They shared food. They supported each other. They tried to maintain hope that the war would end and they would return home. Then in October 1942, Maria's name was called during evening roll call. She was ordered to report to the medical barracks. She did not know why. She asked other prisoners what it meant. No one knew for certain, but rumors circulated. Medical experiments, surgical procedures. People who went to the medical barracks often did not return, or returned permanently damaged. Maria reported as ordered. She was examined by a German doctor who spoke no Polish. He measured her height, weight, vital signs. He examined her legs carefully, making notes. He spoke to a nurse in German. Maria understood nothing. The next morning, guards came to Maria's barracks. They took her and 5 other Polish women to a separate building. Inside was a surgical theater. Tables with restraints, equipment that looked medical but menacing, doctors in white coats, nurses preparing instruments. Maria was ordered to lie on a table. She refused. Guards forced her down. Leather straps were fastened around her wrists, ankles, and chest. She could not move. A doctor approached. He held a scalpel. Maria asked what was happening. No one answered. She asked again in broken German. Still no response. The doctor made the first incision in her left leg without anesthesia. Maria screamed. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced. The scalpel cut deep into muscle tissue. Blood flowed freely. Maria thrashed against the restraints but could not escape. The doctor continued cutting. He created a second incision in her right leg. Then he did something that Maria, even years later, struggled to describe. He inserted foreign materials into the wounds. Splinters of wood, fragments of glass, dirt, bacteria cultures grown in laboratory dishes. He was deliberately contaminating her injuries, creating infections, making wounds that would not heal naturally. The procedure lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Maria's legs were roughly bandaged and she was returned to her barracks. Other prisoners helped her. They smuggled medicines. They provided care. But Maria developed fever within hours. The infection spread rapidly. Her legs swelled. The pain was constant. For weeks she hovered between life and death. Other prisoners prayed for her. Some prisoners who underwent similar procedures died. Their bodies were taken away. No records were kept of their deaths beyond clinical notes in doctors' journals. Maria survived. But her legs never fully healed. The scars remained. The muscle damage was permanent. Walking became difficult. Running was impossible. Her life had been fundamentally altered by 90 minutes of deliberate cruelty disguised as medical research. As Maria testified in the Nuremberg courtroom, she spoke directly to the judges, but her words were heard by everyone present. She described the pain. She described the infections. She described watching other prisoners die from similar procedures. She described the doctors who performed these experiments with clinical detachment, as though she were a laboratory animal rather than a human being. The German prisoners of war in the observation section listened. Some stared at the floor. Some closed their eyes. Some wept silently. One man, a former guard at Ravensbrück named Dieter Schwartz, began shaking uncontrollably. He had seen Maria taken to the medical barracks. He had been part of the system that delivered prisoners to their torturers. He had told himself he was just following orders, just doing his job, just surviving the war. But now Maria was speaking. She had a voice. She had a name. She had a story that extended before and beyond her victimization. She had been a student. She had studied literature. She had a mother who screamed, and a father who tried to protect her. She had been a person with dreams and hopes and a future, and German doctors, enabled by German guards, supported by German administrators, had destroyed that future in the name of science that was not science but torture. The prosecutor asked Maria to show the court her scars. She stood. She lifted her skirt to reveal her legs. The scars were extensive, raised, discolored, permanent evidence of what had been done. Photographers documented the scars. The images were entered into evidence. The defendants could not claim exaggeration. The defendants could not claim propaganda. The evidence was standing before them, speaking in her own voice, bearing permanent marks of their crimes. After Maria's testimony, the prosecutor called another survivor, and then another, and then another. Day after day, survivors spoke. Polish women who had undergone the same surgical experiments Maria described. Soviet prisoners subjected to freezing experiments. Jewish prisoners used to test vaccines for epidemic diseases. Romani prisoners exposed to chemical agents. Each survivor told a similar story. Arrest for political or racial reasons. Transfer to concentration camps. Selection for experiments without explanation. Procedures conducted without consent or anesthesia. Permanent physical and psychological damage. And through it all, German doctors maintaining meticulous records, taking precise measurements, documenting results with scientific language that masked the reality of systematic torture. The German prisoners of war watching the trial began to collapse, not physically but psychologically. Their worldview could not accommodate the testimony they were hearing. They had been taught that their victims were subhuman, that their suffering was necessary, that science justified the experiments. But the victims were speaking. They were articulate. They were human in ways that Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible. And they were speaking not in secret, not in whispers, but in an American courtroom that protected their right to testify, that gave them voice, that ensured their stories would be heard and documented and preserved for history. Day after day, the Nuremberg courtroom filled with survivor testimony. The pattern became undeniable. The systematic nature of the experiments became impossible to deny. The German defendants sat and listened as their crimes were detailed by people they had attempted to erase from history. One survivor, a Soviet prisoner named Vladimir Petrov, testified about freezing experiments. He described being placed in large tanks filled with ice water. He described how doctors timed how long he could survive as his body temperature dropped toward lethal levels. He described the agony of frostbite setting in. He described losing consciousness and waking up with amputated limbs. He held up his prosthetic hands as he testified. The evidence was visible, undeniable, permanent. The prosecutor asked Vladimir how many people he had observed undergoing similar procedures. Vladimir estimated 60 to 70 prisoners had been subjected to freezing experiments. He stated that at least 40% had died. The defendant's lawyer attempted to argue that these experiments had value for understanding how to treat combat injuries in the Russian winter. The prosecutor responded by asking Vladimir if he had consented to participate. The answer was no. Vladimir had been selected arbitrarily. He had been told nothing about the procedures he would undergo. He had been restrained and subjected to torture disguised as science. There was no informed consent. There was no medical justification. There was only cruelty. Another survivor, a Polish woman named Helena Zykowska, testified about surgical experiments. She described deliberate wounds being created in her body. She described watching medical personnel inject bacteria into open wounds. She described the infections that developed, the fevers, the pain that never fully subsided even years later. She testified that she believed she would die during the procedures. She testified that she wanted to die rather than continue suffering. She testified that she had watched other women undergo similar procedures, and many had not survived. The prosecutor showed photographs of Helena's scars. The images were entered into the trial record. They were distributed to journalists. They would appear in newspapers and magazines around the world. The photographs made abstract claims about crimes concrete and visible. They made the suffering of survivors impossible to ignore or minimize. As days of testimony accumulated, the German prisoners of war in the observation section began to show visible signs of psychological collapse. Some developed tremors in their hands. Some stopped eating. Some stared at the floor continuously, unable to meet the eyes of the survivors who testified. One former guard named Friedrich Bauer began weeping during testimony by a survivor who described watching her cellmate die from an infection deliberately introduced by experimenters. Bauer collapsed in the courtroom and had to be carried out. Other guards remained impassive, but their impassivity seemed like the complete shutting down of emotional function rather than genuine composure. The testimony was not limited to victims. The prosecution also called doctors and nurses who had worked at the camps but had not directly participated in experiments. These witnesses testified about the knowledge that was widespread among medical personnel. Everyone knew that experiments were occurring. Everyone understood that prisoners had not consented. Everyone saw the evidence of suffering. The defense attempted to portray the experiments as isolated incidents conducted by rogue individuals. The testimony of medical staff demolished that argument. There had been collaboration across multiple camps. There had been regular meetings between doctors conducting experiments at different facilities. There had been correspondence detailing experimental protocols and results. The experiments had been systematic, coordinated, and known to medical authorities throughout the Nazi regime. One particularly damning witness was Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, a female physician who had participated in experiments at Ravensbrück. Rather than denying participation, Oberhäuser attempted to minimize its significance. She claimed the experiments had been conducted to advance medical knowledge. She claimed the subjects had been criminals and therefore undeserving of protection. She claimed she had merely followed the direction of her superiors. Under cross-examination by the prosecution, Oberhäuser's claims collapsed. She was confronted with her own notes describing procedures on healthy prisoners. She was confronted with her own correspondence requesting additional subjects for experiments. She was confronted with the fact that she had never witnessed informed consent being obtained from a single subject. She was confronted with the reality that she, a woman in a male-dominated field, had seized the opportunity to conduct experiments that she never would have been permitted to conduct in any legitimate medical setting. The prosecution showed Oberhäuser photographs of survivors she had experimented on. She refused to look at the photographs. The prosecutor insisted. The judge ordered her to examine the photographs. Oberhäuser finally looked, and she began to cry. Not, observers noted, tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity, of regret at having been caught, of despair at her own fate. The German prisoners of war observing the trial saw something different in the survivors' testimony than what the defendants saw. The prisoners saw the faces of people who had endured and survived. They saw the determination of people whose voices had been suppressed and were now being heard. They saw the American legal system giving voice to the powerless, protecting the rights of the violated, ensuring that perpetrators would face testimony and judgment. They saw American justice working in real time. One of the prisoners, a man named Otto Leiker who had worked as an orderly at Camp Gusen, was interviewed years after the trial. He described his experience watching the testimony. He said, "The survivors were the real authority in that courtroom, not the judges though they represented law, not the lawyers though they represented arguments. The survivors represented truth. They had lived through what the defendants had inflicted. They could not be contradicted. They could not be explained away. They could not be minimized. Their testimony was the end of all possible defense. It was the end of all possible denial. It was the end of all possible escape from accountability. And I understood as I watched them testify that Germany had lost far more than a war. We had lost our humanity." The Nuremberg Doctors Trial concluded on August 20th, 1947. The verdict was delivered to a courtroom packed with observers. 16 defendants were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. 9 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 were acquitted. But the trial's most significant legacy was not the punishments imposed on individual defendants. The legacy was the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 principles governing medical research ethics. The code emerged directly from the trial proceedings. It was written by American physicians and lawyers working with the prosecution. It represented American values about individual rights, informed consent, and the inviolability of human dignity. The first principle of the Nuremberg Code was read aloud in court. The German prisoners of war, who had thought the proceedings would end with verdicts, now had to confront the implications of international law being rewritten specifically to prevent what their nation had done. The first principle stated, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential." This was revolutionary. It meant that no person could be subjected to medical experimentation without freely given informed consent. No prisoner could be forced into research. No child could be used as a test subject without parental consent. No person could be deceived about the purposes or risks of experimentation. The principle eliminated every justification the Nazi doctors had offered. It established that certain actions were wrong regardless of potential scientific benefit, regardless of national emergency, regardless of orders from superiors. Subsequent principles addressed the scientific validity of experiments. The code required that experiments yield beneficial results unobtainable by other means. This eliminated the Nazi claim that torture could be justified as necessary research. The code required that researchers minimize harm and protect subjects from injury. The code established that subjects retained the right to withdraw from experiments at any time. The code placed responsibility for harm on the researcher, not on military or political superiors. And most fundamentally, the code established that certain research could not ethically be conducted regardless of benefits that might result. The code was adopted by the international medical community. It was translated into multiple languages. It became foundational to medical ethics globally. Decades later, American medical schools would teach the Nuremberg Code as the basis for all subsequent medical research ethics. The code would inform the creation of the Declaration of Helsinki. It would influence the development of federal regulations governing human subjects research. It would reshape how the world understood the relationship between science and ethics. As the trial concluded, the German prisoners of war were informed that they could return to civilian life. Some would be tried further by German courts. Some would be convicted of lesser crimes. Some would eventually return to normal lives. But none would return to the life they had known before the trial. None could forget the faces of the survivors. None could unhear the testimony. None could escape the knowledge that their nation had conducted systematic torture and that the world had responded by establishing principles to prevent repetition. The prosecutors, judges, and lawyers who established the Nuremberg Code understood that trials alone could not prevent atrocities. Laws alone could not prevent atrocities. What was required was a fundamental reordering of how the world understood medical ethics. What was required was American leadership in establishing principles that placed human rights and dignity above scientific advancement. What was required was the commitment to ensure that the survivors' testimony would create legal frameworks that would protect future generations from similar abuses. The trial had given voice to the silenced. American justice had ensured that victims could speak, that their testimony would be heard, that perpetrators would be held accountable. And from that testimony, from that accountability, from that commitment to justice, emerged principles that would reshape medicine and human rights for generations. The German prisoners of war who had collapsed when confronted with survivor testimony had witnessed something unprecedented. They had witnessed victims not as abstract claims in documents, but as human beings with names and faces and stories. They had witnessed American justice not as abstract concept, but as mechanism for protecting the powerless and holding the powerful accountable. They had witnessed the transformation of trauma into testimony, into law, and they understood that whatever punishments the perpetrators received, whatever trials would follow, the most significant outcome was the creation of a new international legal and ethical order, an order that said unequivocally that certain things could not be done to human beings, regardless of circumstance, regardless of order, regardless of claimed scientific benefit. An order that said the testimony of victims mattered more than the credentials of perpetrators. An order that said American justice, applied fairly and transparently, could reshape the world. June 2, 1948. Landsberg Prison in Bavaria. 7 Nazi doctors stood in a line, hands bound behind their backs. They had been convicted at Nuremberg. They had received death sentences. They had appealed unsuccessfully. Now they faced the consequences of their choices. The executions were documented. Photographers captured the moment. Military personnel witnessed the procedures. The documentation was intentional. General Eisenhower had ordered that the executions be recorded and that photographs be made public. He believed that the world needed to see that perpetrators of atrocities would face ultimate justice. He believed that avoiding the reality of executions, hiding them from view, would diminish the impact of accountability. The 7 men walked to the gallows. Some appeared calm, some appeared terrified, some appeared defiant. One doctor, Josef Mengele, was not among those executed. He had escaped to South America before the trial concluded. He would evade capture for decades. He would die in South America in 1979, never facing the justice his crimes merited. But the other 7 would not escape. They would not avoid accountability. They would not return to medical practice or normal lives. Their executions marked the end of Nuremberg. The trial had concluded. The code had been established. Justice had been delivered. But the impact was far from complete. The Nuremberg Code spread through the medical world. It was adopted by the World Medical Association. It was incorporated into the laws of nations throughout Europe and North America. It became the foundation for how medical research would be regulated globally. American medical schools taught the code. American medical associations adopted it as binding principle. American researchers understood that experiments on human subjects required informed consent, institutional oversight, and protection of subject rights. The code transformed medical practice. It eliminated the possibility that researchers could conduct experiments on prisoners or vulnerable populations without consent. It established that vulnerable populations required additional protections, not diminished rights. It established that prisoners and institutionalized people retained full human rights regardless of their legal status. American leadership in establishing the Nuremberg Code represented an American commitment to human rights that extended beyond the war's end. The code was not imposed through military force. It was adopted through persuasion and the moral authority of the American legal system. American prosecutors had demonstrated that justice was possible. American judges had shown that accountability could be achieved. American lawyers had drafted principles that reflected American values about human dignity and individual rights. The German prisoners of war who had witnessed the trial gradually returned to civilian life. Some attempted to process their experiences through writing. Some became educators determined to ensure that future generations would understand what had happened and why it must never happen again. Some struggled with guilt that never diminished with time. One former guard, Gustav Bauer, who had stood outside the surgical theaters and had heard the screams of prisoners, wrote a letter to his family before his death in 1962. The letter was discovered years later and published in a German historical archive. In the letter, Bauer reflected on watching the Nuremberg trial. He wrote, "Watching survivors testify transformed my understanding of responsibility. I had believed that following orders, that doing my job, that not directly participating in crimes meant I bore no responsibility. But I understood while watching the trial that responsibility exists at every level. I guarded doors behind which torture occurred. I did nothing to prevent it. I did nothing to protest it. I accepted comfortable lies rather than investigate difficult truths. I'm guilty. Not to the same degree as the doctors, but guilty nonetheless. I have carried this guilt every day since the trial. I have attempted to atone through teaching my children to question authority, to protect the vulnerable, to recognize their own capacity for complicity. I do not seek forgiveness. I seek only that others learn from my failures, that others recognize that ordinary people in ordinary positions can enable extraordinary evil through their choices and their silences." Another former prisoner, Otto Kellner, who had worked in administrative roles processing prisoners for transfer to experimental facilities, also wrote about his experiences. He wrote, "The trial destroyed my sense of identity. I believed myself to be a decent person. I told myself I was simply doing administrative work, maintaining records, following procedures. But the trial revealed that my work, however administrative, had facilitated torture. My paperwork had processed the prisoners who would be experimented on. My files had tracked their movement through the system. My work had been essential to the machinery of atrocity. I cannot claim that I did not know what I was participating in. I knew, everyone knew. We chose not to examine that knowledge too closely. We chose comfort over truth. The trial forced us to examine that choice, and there could be no return to innocence after that examination. The German prisoners of war and guards who had witnessed the trial understood something that many observers of history failed to grasp. They understood that testimony from survivors had been more powerful than any documents, any photographs, any legal arguments. They understood that giving voice to the silenced was transformative. They understood that American justice, at its best, protected the powerless and held the powerful accountable. They understood that the moral universe had been fundamentally reordered by American commitment to establishing principles that would prevent repetition of such atrocities. The impact of the trial extended far beyond Germany. The Nuremberg Code influenced the development of research ethics in every nation. It influenced international human rights law. It influenced how other nations understood the relationship between science and ethics. It influenced how the world would respond to future atrocities by establishing principles that any perpetrator would have to confront and violate explicitly. The executions at Landsberg prison represented the end of Nuremberg. But they represented a beginning for a new understanding of international law and human rights. They represented the moment when the world committed to establishing principles that certain actions could not be undertaken, regardless of orders, regardless of scientific benefit, regardless of national interest. They represented American leadership in establishing a moral and legal framework that would protect human dignity for generations to come. Decades after Nuremberg, the survivors of Nazi medical experiments carried their stories with them. Many emigrated. Many established new lives in the United States, Israel, Canada, and other nations. Many became educators and advocates for human rights. Maria Kusmierczuk, whose testimony had silenced the courtroom, emigrated to the United States. She settled in New York. She worked as a seamstress. She raised a family, and she spent decades speaking to audiences about her experiences. She spoke at universities. She spoke at Holocaust memorials. She spoke at medical schools. Her testimony reminded each new generation that the Nuremberg Code was not merely historical artifact, but living principle born from real suffering. Maria lived until 2006. In interviews conducted near the end of her life, she reflected on the importance of testimony. She said, "When I testified at Nuremberg, I spoke for myself and for all those who did not survive to speak. I spoke for the women who died from infections deliberately introduced by doctors. I spoke for those whose names were never recorded, whose deaths were never documented, who were simply erased. Speaking mattered. It made the suffering real. It made it impossible for anyone to deny that atrocities had occurred. It provided accountability. It provided justice, or at least as much justice as is possible when the damage cannot be undone and the trauma cannot be erased." The Nuremberg Code became the foundation for all subsequent medical research ethics. When the Tuskegee syphilis study was exposed in 1972, a study in which African American men had been deliberately left untreated to observe disease progression, critics explicitly referenced the Nuremberg Code. They argued that American researchers had violated the same principles established at Nuremberg. The outcry led to legislation. The National Research Act of 1974 established institutional review boards for all federally funded research. The act required informed consent. It required that researchers minimize harm and maximize benefit. It required that vulnerable populations receive special protections. These requirements were direct descendants of the Nuremberg Code. American medical institutions understood that research ethics, established at Nuremberg in response to Nazi atrocities, were binding principles that would govern American medical research in perpetuity. The Nuremberg Code also influenced how the world responded to subsequent human rights violations. When atrocities were committed in other nations, the international community pointed to Nuremberg as precedent. When individuals violated human rights, the international community invoked the Nuremberg principles in establishing their accountability. The code became more than a response to Nazi crimes. It became a framework for preventing future crimes. It established principles that transcended national borders and particular historical circumstances. It said that certain actions were wrong regardless of time period, regardless of nation, regardless of claim justification. The German prisoners of war who survived the war and the trial eventually passed away. But their testimony, recorded in trial transcripts, preserved in military archives, documented in memoirs, remained. Their experience of watching survivors testify, of confronting documented evidence of atrocities, of witnessing American justice, became part of the historical record. It became part of what the world learned about the consequences of complicity, the power of testimony, and the importance of establishing ethical principles that would prevent repetition. The German nation itself carried forward lessons from Nuremberg. After the war, West Germany engaged in a process of confronting its Nazi past. Memorials were established. Trials were held. Education about the Holocaust became mandatory in schools. The Nuremberg Code was incorporated into German medical practice and law. Germany became a model for how a nation could confront historical atrocities and establish mechanisms to prevent repetition. The Nuremberg trials, including the Doctors Trial, became foundational to how the world understood justice after atrocity. They established that perpetrators could be held accountable through legal process. They established that testimony from survivors was essential to justice. They established that the international community had responsibility to establish principles that would protect human rights. They established that American leadership in establishing ethical principles was essential to preventing future atrocities. The survivors, the perpetrators, the prosecutors, the judges, and the observers of the trial all understood that something unprecedented was occurring. They understood that the world was being remade. They understood that American values about human dignity and individual rights were being enshrined in international law. They understood that the testimony of victims was more powerful than any other form of evidence. They understood that justice, real and meaningful justice, required confronting perpetrators with the suffering they had inflicted and establishing mechanisms to prevent repetition. The photographs from the secret laboratory rooms at Ravensbrück, Dachau, Auschwitz, and Camp Gusen remained preserved in archives after 1948. They were held in climate-controlled facilities. They were carefully documented. They were protected from degradation. They were made available to historians, researchers, educators, and survivors seeking to understand what had occurred. The photographs that had silenced German prisoners of war in 1946 became historical artifacts of unprecedented importance. They documented crimes so profound that they transcended individual cases and became evidence of systemic atrocities. They became the foundation for how the world would understand and remember Nazi medical experimentation. The Nuremberg Code, born from testimony and evidence presented at trial, spread through the global medical community. Medical schools across Europe, North America, and eventually worldwide incorporated the Code's principles into their curricula. Medical students learned not just technical skills but ethical principles, grounded in the testimony of survivors and the prosecution of perpetrators. Every medical student who studied the Code was exposed to the history of what happened when medical ethics were abandoned. Every researcher who applied for approval to conduct human subject research understood they were operating under principles established because Nazi doctors had conducted systematic torture. The Code was not merely a set of abstract principles. It was grounded in real suffering, real victims, real survivors who had testified to make the world understand what must never happen again. International organizations built upon the foundation of the Nuremberg Code. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, refined and expanded the Code's principles. The declaration stated that research on human subjects must be conducted with informed consent, ethical review, and protection of vulnerable populations. The declaration stated that the welfare of the subject must take precedence over the interests of science and society. These principles, directly descended from Nuremberg, became the standard for medical research globally. Nations that adopted the declaration committed to ensuring that their medical research complied with principles established because survivors had testified about what had been done to them. The United States, which had led the prosecution at Nuremberg and had drafted the Code, committed itself to upholding these principles in American medical practice. American medical institutions established institutional review boards to oversee human subject research. American medical associations adopted ethics codes grounded in Nuremberg principles. American researchers understood that violating these principles could result in loss of licensure, loss of funding, and criminal prosecution. American leadership in establishing and maintaining these principles represented an American commitment to ensuring that the testimony of survivors would shape medical practice for generations. When scandals emerged in American medicine, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study or the use of prisoners in non-therapeutic research, critics explicitly referenced Nuremberg. They argued that American researchers had violated the same principles established at Nuremberg. They connected contemporary American abuses to Nazi atrocities. They invoked the memory of survivors whose testimony had led to the creation of protective principles. This invocation of Nuremberg by American civil rights advocates and medical ethicists represented the power of the trial's legacy. The trial was not merely a historical event. It was ongoing presence in medical practice, in ethical discussion, in how the world understood the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable medical practice. The German prisoners of war who witnessed the trial and the testimony of survivors carried the experience with them for decades. Many wrote memoirs. Many spoke to audiences. Many became advocates for human rights and ethical responsibility. Their experience of watching justice unfold, of seeing American courts give voice to the silenced, of observing the creation of international principles established to prevent repetition, transformed their understanding of morality and accountability. One former guard, Friedrich Bauer, who had nearly collapsed in the courtroom during survivor testimony, spent the remainder of his life teaching about the trial. He gave lectures at German schools. He participated in documentaries about Nuremberg. He spoke about the importance of recognizing complicity and the impossibility of claiming ignorance when suffering is occurring in one's immediate environment. He died in 1974. In his final interview, conducted weeks before his death, Bauer reflected on the trial and its impact. He said, "The trial was the moment when the world rejected what we had done. The testimony of survivors was the mechanism through which that rejection occurred. They spoke. We listened. The world listened. And everything changed. Laws were written. Principles were established. Institutions were reformed, all because survivors had the courage to speak, and Americans had the commitment to listen and ensure that justice occurred. I have spent my life attempting to live with the consequences of my complicity and attempting to ensure that others would recognize their capacity for complicity and choose differently. The trial made that mission possible. It showed that ordinary people could be held accountable. It showed that testimony from victims could transform institutions and laws. It showed that American justice, when applied fairly and transparently, could reshape the world. Another survivor, Maria Kusmierczuk, reflected near the end of her life on the importance of the trial. She said testifying was terrifying. Standing before men who had participated in my torture, describing what had been done to me, knowing that my testimony would be analyzed and debated, all of this was extremely difficult, but it was also necessary. The trial gave me a voice. It gave voice to millions who had been silenced by Nazi ideology. It showed that victim testimony mattered more than perpetrator credentials. It showed that education and professional status could not shield people from accountability for torture. It showed that American commitment to justice could overcome the attempts of perpetrators to escape consequences. The trial changed me. It gave my suffering meaning. It transformed my trauma into testimony that would shape medical ethics for generations. That transformation, that giving of meaning to suffering, that commitment to ensuring that future victims would be protected by principles established because of my testimony, that gave me a reason to live and to speak for the remainder of my life. The Nuremberg Doctors Trial remains one of the most significant legal proceedings in history. It established principles that continue to govern medical research 75 years later. Every institutional review board in the world operates under principles descended from Nuremberg. Every researcher who seeks informed consent does so because survivors testified at Nuremberg. Every medical student who learns about research ethics learns principles grounded in the prosecution of Nazi doctors. The trial demonstrated that justice, real and meaningful justice, required confronting perpetrators with evidence of their crimes, listening to victim testimony, and establishing principles to prevent repetition. The silence of German prisoners of war when confronted with testimony from survivors represented recognition that their worldview had been demolished. But that silence also represented something else. It represented the beginning of a new understanding of responsibility, accountability, and the possibility of moral transformation, even after participating in or enabling extraordinary evil. The silence became the foundation for voices that would speak for decades afterward, voices that would educate new generations, voices that would ensure that the principles established at Nuremberg would endure and shape how humanity understood the relationship between science, ethics, and human dignity. The photographs from the secret laboratory rooms speak across 75 years through that silence. They speak through the archives that preserve them. They speak through the institutional review boards that exist because of Nuremberg. They speak through every consent form that a researcher obtains before conducting human subject research. They speak through the commitment of the international medical community to principles established because American justice gave voice to the silenced and established that certain actions could never be justified regardless of claimed scientific benefit or national emergency. The trial that began in December 1946 concluded in August 1947. The sentences were carried out in June 1948. But the impact continues to unfold across generations. Every medical school graduation represents the continuation of principles established at Nuremberg. Every human subject who provides informed consent to participate in research benefits from protections established because survivors testified about what had been done to them without consent. Every nation that adopts principles limiting medical experimentation on vulnerable populations does so because American prosecutors secured convictions of Nazi doctors and established international principles to prevent repetition. The silence of the German prisoners of war observing the trial became the voice of the survivors, and that voice continues to speak across time, transforming medical practice, protecting human dignity, and ensuring that the lessons of Nuremberg endure.